All right. Moment of truth. Oh, that's really starting to look like something. Welcome back to Ice Moon, the series where we're building an immersive experience for Apple Vision Pro together, step by step. In this week's episode, we're going to be building the terrain of Ice Moon using SideFX Houdini's procedural tools. Don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps support this channel. Last time we left off, we had a really basic version of our terrain, a prototype built out of blocks, and it gave us a great sense of scale, but how do we take this and actually start to make it feel real? For this, we're going to turn once again to SideFX Houdini. It's a powerful, procedurally driven app, and it's used by Apple in their own high-quality, immersive environments. But what is procedural modeling, and why do we care? Let's look at an example. Let's say we wanted to create a basic terrain full of trees. We can start with a grid and then connect that to a mountain node. This adds some random noise and roughness to our terrain. Next, we can scatter some points across this terrain. These will be used to place the trees. Now we need a tree model, so we'll start with something basic like a tube cylinder primitive, and then I'll scale the tip of it down just so it looks a little bit more tree-like. Once we've got that, we can attach it to a copy to points node, and then connect the second input to those scattered points from earlier. This will duplicate our basic tree model across the whole landscape. And because it's procedural, we can go back and experiment with things like how many points were scattered, or insert entirely new nodes into the chain like a subdivide to smooth out that terrain model a little bit. The advantage of this type of workflow is that we can keep iterating non-destructively until we arrive at something that we're happy with. So that's procedural modeling at a high level. But Houdini offers a specific set of tools that are really tailored for this process, and those are called height fields. At a very basic level, a height field is just a 2D image that can represent your three-dimensional terrain, where the lighter tones in the image represent peaks and the darker tones will become valleys. Houdini has a bunch of tools for manipulating these height fields, like the Erosion node. The Erosion node is cool because it will perform a simulation of how things like water and heat gradually etch away at your terrain and give you some really nice organic looking effects. For our Ice Moon terrain, we're going to begin with a height field that's about 2.5 kilometers by 2.5 kilometers. When we look at the concept art, we can see that from the vantage point of the user, there are these long, snowy, flat plains. But then there's also this kind of mountainous region behind the user. So how do we make that? We'll start by connecting a height field noise node. This lets us experiment with a whole bunch of different noise types to get some really interesting effects. We could play with things like the amplitude and the element size to really dial in what we're looking for. But this gives us a uniform noise, and we want that one area to be flat. For this, we're going to turn to masking. If you've ever used Photoshop, you're probably familiar with masks. You're basically creating an image that will define where an effect is stronger or weaker. This could be painted, or you could use something like a gradient. In Houdini, we're going to use a second height field as our mask. We're going to connect this to a pattern node. There are a lot of cool patterns you can experiment with, but what we're after is a ramp, which will basically behave like a gradient. We can connect this new height field to our noise and treat it as a height mask. And now we can dial in exactly where we want those mountains to be in a very intuitive way. One of the most striking features of Ice Moon are the geysers, and around the geysers are these craters. Houdini's height fields have a tool that's really good for this, and that's the height field project node. With this, we can take other pieces of geometry and project them onto the surface, either as additions or subtractions. In this case, we're going to start with a sphere and project it using the minimum setting. This will carve out a sphere-like hole and create the basis of our crater. Now, the craters also have these crater walls. You can think of this as where the nitrogen, snow, and debris have been falling for centuries. So we'll create another projection, but this time instead of subtracting, we'll do an addition. We'll use a torus as our input shape, and then when we project this on, we're getting something a lot more like our concept art. But it's a little too smooth, so we can add some noise to our input geometry and just rough it up a little bit, and already it's starting to look a lot more natural. We'll use basically the same exact technique to create all the rocks that surround the user in the center of the scene. But first, I want to use one of those erosion nodes we talked about earlier. Right now, the landscape feels a little bit CG. The noise is a little too uniform. Like I mentioned earlier, the erosion node will actually perform a simulation of how water and heat etch away at the landscape over time. All of this will really help our Ice Moon feel like an old place and give it a much more natural appearance. After the erosion, I also added a slump node. This is great for making it feel like snow is built up in large drifts in different parts of the terrain. And speaking of snow, one of my favorite elements is how on these large plains, we get this windswept look. To achieve this, we're going to go once again back to a pattern node, select a ramp, and we're going to draw kind of a wave-like pattern in here. It's going to be a little bit repetitive by default, so we can enable curl noise, which will add some really nice distortion and make this whole thing feel more natural. This is already looking light years beyond what we had when this was just a building block prototype. We've just started to scratch the surface of what you could do with these tools in Houdini. But the high-level thing is that proceduralism lets you have fun and iterate until you find something that you like. In an upcoming episode, we'll look at how materials and lighting can really elevate the look of this environment and how optimizations that Apple uses for their own environments can get this all to run efficiently on device.